Hello, everyone. Ryan Kelly here. Secondaries are officially out as of yesterday, June 27th. This is my 12th or 13th cycle doing secondaries, so I promise you it will be okay. And in about a month, everything will be over. But for now, we got to put our heads down, we got to get a lot of work done, and we got to focus on not only which secondaries have come out, but which ones have changed from prior years and how we're going to handle all of the most common questions that appear in the essays. One thing I wanted to talk about right away was a trend I've been noticing in some of the earliest schools that have been released. One trend is that it seems like diversity questions are changing a little bit. I think two good examples are for Kaiser Permanente and for Wake Forest. So Wake Forest is the kind of school that just sort of changed the wording of the prompt, where they got rid of things about barriers and disadvantages and aren't using any of the sort of DEI charged terms that we've seen in the past. And instead, they're just asking about how you're going to contribute to healthcare for all. So a more sort of, I don't know, euphemistic or widespreading, wide ranging way of discussing it. But then some schools like Kaiser have just gotten rid of the diversity essay pretty much entirely. And instead, they've replaced it with an essay that's about being an innovator, being a leader, being a creator, which for some people you might still be able to talk about issues of diversity, but for other people it may mean rewriting a new essay that you didn't have before or something like that. So that's one trend, and I think we'll continue to see that, maybe just because of the political climate. Either the wording of diversity essays will change or they'll disappear in some schools. But what's important to note is probably if you wrote a diversity essay, it'll probably still work even if the school has changed the prompt. So don't get thrown too much by the specific language of the prompts. And we'll definitely report on more trends we see, but that was probably the first one I noticed immediately. So look out for that. Yeah, so I've already been getting a lot of questions from students about what they should do when they encounter an optional prompt or a prompt that basically asks them whether they have anything else they want to share with the school. And you get a lot of differing opinions about what to do with these. There are some people that are like optional really just means optional, like don't do it unless you have a good reason to. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, actually. Personally, I think you have to consider a lot of factors, not only who you are as a candidate in terms of whether you have hardships and disadvantages that you'd like to share, issues with grades and your academics in the past that you'd like to clear up or share, but also just considering how many other questions the school already has and how long those questions are. Because let's say it's a school that already has 6 or 7 essays, maybe they're like 300 or 350 words, then it seems like leaving the optional one blank is totally fine because you've already had a lot of opportunities to tell the school about yourself. Whereas if it's a school that maybe only has 2 prompts, and let's say one of them's about your gap year and then one of them's an optional one. In that case, you really haven't had much of an opportunity to tell them about yourself, really. And so the optional prompt, in my opinion, should be utilized in an effective way to help make an argument for yourself. And oftentimes, that means you use the optional space to write a why our school essay. Now, my logic behind that is if another student does that and does that well, and then you don't, it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't have an advantage over you if they've done it well. So that's not to say you use the optional space to write a really lame, really pandering why our school essay, because that will not be useful and it'll just appear like you're kissing up to the school and you're kind of being a tryhard. But if you can make really good connections to the school, they are going to appreciate that and they're going to value that and they're going to look out for that compared to someone who maybe lazily didn't use the optional essay at all or didn't do any research into them as a school. So I think, people will disagree with me about this, but I've thought about it a lot. I've considered the logic behind it. And so you do have to kind of just make a judgment call based on what you've already been able to tell the school. So I don't feel like optional truly means optional. That's my opinion. So you can do a little bit of an order of operations with it, where it's like, do they have a why our school essay? Yes or no? Do they have a diversity essay? Yes or no? Do they have an opportunity for me to show off my leadership or some of my biggest strengths? Yes or no? And those can kind of guide what you choose to put in that optional space if you choose to use it. So, another question I've been getting a lot is students will encounter prompts that don't have any word or character limits attached to them, and they're wondering what an appropriate amount of space to use is. I think that's going to kind of depend a little bit. I think if a school has a bunch of questions, and they all don't have any limits, then you probably don't want them to be super exhaustive. You probably want them to be more like 250 words or something like that, maybe 1,500 characters. Because I usually think 250 words and 1,500 characters most of the time is about the perfect amount of space to answer a question. And I think it's also the perfect amount of information to read for one idea. So I think if you have one essay with no limit, give it some love and make it about 500 words. But if it's a bunch, you don't want they don't want to get 500 words for 6 or 7 prompts, because that's going to be way too much to read. So you do have to kind of use your judgment a little bit, but that's my take. So another very frequently asked question is, how fast should I send this secondary back to the schools once I receive them? I've always kind of put it this way. I think 2 or 3 days is amazing. I think 1 week is really good. And then I think 2 weeks is acceptable. And I think 2 weeks should really be viewed as sort of your ceiling on how slow you are in sending it back. Because I think if you go any longer than 2 weeks, you're kind of communicating to the school that you weren't very prepared, or worse, that you just don't care about them very much. So they know that you're going to be prioritizing them versus others. And I think sending it back too slowly is just a bad look. So hopefully there are some that you've already pre-written, or that don't take too long for you to cobble together out of the stuff you have pre-written. So those can be the ones you send back in a day or two. And then I do think if someone can say at the end of the process that they never went longer than a week to send something back, that's usually a really good sign of success. So just yesterday, I had a student ask me whether it was okay for them to reuse things from their primary application in their secondary application. And the answer is definitely yes. Now, you don't want to tell the exact same story verbatim. That's a foolish move. But you can talk about the same activities and the same experiences. And in fact, it'd be pretty weird if you didn't at all, because those were such key parts of your path to medicine and your growth and development as a person, that not having them appear in these sort of core questions about your challenges and your diversity and your motivations to medicine and how you connect to their school, it'd be very strange not to double down on something from your primary. So it's really just about figuring out, okay, now that I'm writing about it in the secondary, it has a different function here. It's serving a different purpose. And so therefore I have to write about it a little bit differently. But even if you're making a similar point, as long as you're not writing it in the exact same verbatim way or using the exact same story, it's totally acceptable, and I'd say even encouraged. Another thing that will happen to students sometimes is they'll see a prompt and they'll feel like they really have nothing that perfectly fits what the prompt is asking for. So, one just example would be if a student was working on a school like Case Western, or maybe Virginia Tech, or some school that has longer essays that are about research, and they don't really have that much research. Should they skip it or try to figure out something? I think honestly, if a school cares that much about research that they have a whole secondary about it, and you are coming up short with research, it's probably a sign that you may not even want to apply there, because you're not really going to be competitive. I think if it's more of a minor type question where it's like, oh, just list the research experiences you have, then maybe just leave that one blank. But I think if it's a school like Case or VTC where it's like, tell us your most significant research experience and how it influenced your future and all that kind of stuff, it's probably a sign that it might not be the right school for your list. So another question I've been getting a lot is whether people should address low grades or academic probation or dips in their GPA or things like that. The answer is probably yes, especially if the school directly has a question relating to your academic history, or if they have an optional essay that lets you discuss anything that you want. Both of those are probably a good time to control your narrative surrounding the situation, and that way you can tell them your story the way you want it to be hopefully interpreted, rather than them just seeing these issues on your transcript and having an elephant in the room that you're not explaining anywhere. I would say if you explained in your primary application already, then maybe you don't need to double down on it, especially voluntarily. I think obviously if there's a secondary with a prompt that asks about your grades, then okay, but you may not need to voluntarily share it if you already have in your primary application. But generally, I think it's misguided to think, oh, they're not going to notice, or why should I draw attention to this needlessly, when the truth is like they're going to notice. And they're going to probably think it's weird if it's there and you haven't addressed it. So I think be transparent, be honest, make the best case you can for yourself and how you've improved and how you've rectified the situation. Be very positive, focus on the challenge and the setback and the failure as an opportunity for growth, and show the evidence of your improvement. And I think that's what you can do to handle those. One of the essay genres that students struggle with the most are the why do you want to go here, or the why our school essays, as they're sometimes called. And I think the secret really is that, in a kind of a counterintuitive way, these essays are actually more about you than they are about the school, because the school knows what they have, but they don't know why it's so meaningful or personally relevant to you. And so you are actually kind of the main event and the secret ingredient in this whole answer. Yes, you do need to bring up specific things about the school in terms of their curriculum, their research opportunities, their service and outreach opportunities. You do want to have some concrete, specific things that will require you to do research into the school. But what you spend most of the time in the essay doing is teeing up to those things with information about yourself. So that could be information about your learning style and your past academic history that you then use to tee up to some aspect of their curriculum, like a curricular track they have. Or you may talk about all the time that you spent in this particular lab researching this topic of interest to you, and how they have ongoing projects at their school that study similar topics. So you're always teeing up to them with something about you. And what's nice is that lets your essays be longer when they need to be longer, and they really get to know who you are, which is kind of the secret, because it's not just why do you want to go to our school, it's why are we a mutually beneficial fit. And I think the other nice side bonus of this is that when you go to do another school's why our school essay, you have more reusable content because you've written so much about yourself that you can then put in and just swap in new information about the other schools. And it won't really transparently look like a template, even though it will be a template for you. It'll kind of still appear like a love letter to the school because you've spent so much time being like, here's who I am and here's why you're so great for me. And even if you reuse it 100 times, it won't be as transparent as you might think. And so talking about yourself is not only more effective, but it's also strategic for the entire secondary essay writing process.